Let's go to our topic of the day. Indonesia has expressed its desire to become a member of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, since several years ago. But this time, the Indonesian looks more serious in joining the international organization, which currently has 38 member countries that span around the globe, from North and South America to Europe, as well as Asia Pacific.
Indonesia is set to become a member of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, after the organization informed its readiness to accept the Southeast Asian country as its new member. Speaking to journalists at the Presidential Palace in Jakarta recently, Coordinating Minister for the Economy Airlangga Hartarto said Indonesia had received a notification from OECD about its readiness to accept the country as a new member. Indonesia will become the first Southeast Asian country and the third in Asia after Japan and South Korea to join the OECD. Indonesia's readiness has been informed to all OECD members, which will soon prepare a roadmap for the country to become a full member, Airlangga said. Formed in 1961, the OECD brings together member countries and a range of partners that collaborate on key global issues at national, regional, and local levels. As stated in a document published at the OECD's official website, as many as 38 countries have become its members, which come from North and South America to Europe and Asia Pacific. Former Australian Finance Minister Matthias Cormann was appointed as the OECD Secretary General in 2021 for a 5-year term. Becoming a member of the OECD requires a rigorous review process. The OECD Council, which comprises of all the members of the organization, decides on the opening of the accession discussions. Considerations to open an accession process can be made on the initiative of the Council itself or upon receipt of a written request by a country interested in the OECD membership. An accession roadmap is then adopted by the Council, setting out the terms, conditions, and process for accession. This roadmap lists the technical reviews to be undertaken by OECD committees in various policy areas in order to evaluate the candidate country's willingness and ability to implement a relevant OECD legal instrument. This often results in a series of recommendations for change to align the candidate country further to OECD standards and best practices. The most recent countries to join the OECD were Colombia in April 2020 and Costa Rica in May 2021. On 25th of January 2022, the Council decided to take the first step in accession discussions with 6 candidate countries to OECD membership. They are Argentina, Brazil, Bulgaria, Croatia, Peru, and Romania. The OECD's relationship with Indonesia has grown significantly since 2007, when the OECD designated it a key partner, together with Brazil, China, India, and South Africa. Indonesia was the first key partner to sign a Framework of Cooperation Agreement, or FCA, with the OECD in 2012, and it was renewed in 2017. It can become an entry point for Indonesia to upgrade its status as a full member in the organization. Indonesia's journey towards joining the OECD commenced several years ago, with the country actively engaging in policy reforms, strengthening governance structures, and promoting transparency. The upcoming OECD membership has been a testament to the country's resilience, determination, and global leadership. In the face of the unprecedented challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, conflicts, and climate change, Indonesia has risen to the occasion and demonstrated its capability to lead on the international stage, successfully hosting several international events such as the G20 Summit and the ASEAN Summit. As the country prepares to take its place among the OECD member nations, the future looks promising for Indonesia's economic growth, development, and global recognition. By leveraging this opportunity, Indonesia can solidify its position as a dynamic and influential player in the global economic landscape, while contributing to the advancement of the entire ASEAN community.
Coordinating Minister for Economic Affairs Airlangga Hartarto recently unveiled Indonesia's readiness to join the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. If admitted, Indonesia will become the first Southeast Asian country and the third in Asia after Japan and South Korea to join the OECD. Here with us, our guest is Bima Yudhistira, Executive Director of Center of Economic and Law Studies, CELIOS. Bima will share his views on Indonesia's intention to join OECD and what benefits Indonesia can get from being an OECD member. Good morning, Bima.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me.
All right, it's good to have you here with us on Economic Outlook. Now, Bima, the government recently unveiled its intention to join the OECD. Do you think that becoming a member of such an international organization is still relevant, and is it still necessary for Indonesia amid the rising protectionism in international order?
I do believe that joining the OECD have a positive and negative results for Indonesian economy in general. Because at the same time, we see that many of the G20 countries, for instance, there's a Turkey already joined a long time ago to the OECD. And also we have Chile even as developing countries also joining the OECD. So we perceive that the OECD have a good standard, good economic cooperations that can bridging the developed countries' interests with the developing countries, especially in the Asia Pacific in general. And I do believe that joining the OECD needs more preparations because the OECD needs a higher standard in terms of the governance, as mentioned earlier, about the transparency, about the anti-corruption war, and also about the illicit trade, about the transfer financing from one company in the OECD members to the other companies in the OECD member area, and also how to strengthening the cooperations in terms of the environment. But in the other hand, we see a lot of some challenge, not weakness, but some challenge before joining the OECD. One of them is to set a lot of the local and also central government standard aligning with the OECD standard. For instance, the case of the Brazil, since 2017, Brazil formally want to join or invited to join the OECD club. However, there are more than 250 regulations that need to be adjusted in terms of trade, in terms of the financing, in terms of the governance, and also in terms of the local regulations. And I think until today, the Brazil itself still have a long process to join the OECD. So when Indonesia want to join the OECD, perhaps it takes another 5 years or even 7 years to prepare or harmonizing all of the regulations in the local context to the national context with the OECD standard itself. I think it's a long way process. And also, if we want to join the OECD, bear in mind that many of the OECD countries is developed countries. They already have higher spending of the social protections. In average, from 2018 or before the pandemic, they are average 20% of the minimum government spending on the social protection compared to the GDP. And in the meantime, that Indonesia only have 2.5% social expenditure comparing to the GDP. So we need to bear in mind that there is also consequence that our fiscal space need to have a lot of concerns in terms of the social protection, social spending, and also how to increase the tax, because many of the OECD member countries, they have average more than 20% of the corporate income tax, for instance. So we need to align many of the regulations in the Indonesian context with the OECD standard.
Exactly. Now, Bima, you mentioned already that the OECD has a very high standard and there are a lot of regulations that needs to be aligned, and that is exactly the requirement to become the OECD member, is to follow their strict policy standards such as in trade as well as in investment. Now, do you think that Indonesia is ready enough to meet the OECD's rigorous standards, and how long will it take for us to finally meet with their standard? How many years?
I think it depends, yeah, on what kind of regulations that we need to adjust. A lot of the consideration to adjust in terms of the legals and also cross-border standard, including also trade barriers. Because on the other hand, somehow we need to protect our small medium enterprise. Because if we follow the liberalizations of trade from the OECD member countries, perhaps we can lose many of the small medium enterprise due to high competitions with the big multinational corporations that will be happy to set a standard for more liberal trade policy. On the other hand, perhaps we need to increase also some standard in terms of the local governance, about the corruptions, about the anti-bribery standard. And I think this is the challenge because Indonesia is not a centralistic country. We depend a lot, many of the standard in the local government context. Therefore, the local government need to be involved in this kind of the harmonization process. Therefore, I do believe that it takes around 5 to 7 years to adopt the standard. And even many of the regulations in the national level need to be changed, need to adjust, and also bear in mind there's a lot of consequence. Not only our economy become more competitive, the governance will be better, the environmental standard also will be better, but also there's some disadvantage in terms of the protections of the local small medium enterprise, local entrepreneurship, the import products coming from the OECD member countries that can flow easily to Indonesian market.
All right, so it seems that it will take around 5 to 7 years, as you predicted, for us to meet the OECD standards, but there will be benefits that goes along with that. Now, Bima, by becoming an OECD member, Indonesia can also get international recognition. Do you think this will give Indonesia a wider international support in dealing with trade conflicts, such as those with the European community?
Yeah, I think the OECD is a good platform. We have WTO, we have G20, whereas in the G20 and WTO also involving many of our trade partners in the European continent. However, with the OECD, because the OECD itself is a cooperation between its member countries, we can use the OECD to penetrate the European market. We can set the standard so that many of the European company can happy to invest in Indonesia, can increase the Indonesia and global value chains propositions, and also it can help absorb a lot of the workers in Indonesia. But yeah, I think a lot of to be discussed, because if we discuss it, many of the trade policy with the EU in the hotspot right now, we have a CPO, because the CPO perhaps kind of conflicting with the European current standard. So we need to discuss more about what is the Indonesian interest in terms of the palm oil without increasing number of deforestations or without increasing number of the environmental damages. I think that's kind of one part of the discussions in the OECD. And the other perhaps about the digital economy. In the same time, the OECD have a lot of a platform to bridging the investment in the digital economy. However, I think currently not many of the OECD countries, especially in the European continent, interest in the digital economy in Indonesia compared with the China. And China is outside of the OECD itself.
Now, let's talk about the future. If admitted, Indonesia will be the first ASEAN country to become an OECD member. What can Indonesia contribute to promote the region to the world?
I think if Indonesia eager to join the OECD and finally become part of the OECD member countries, I think the first one, Indonesia can promote better governance, efficiency of the bureaucracy, the clean government, the number of the transparency is increasing, the number of the corruption is decreasing. I think it's a good lesson to learn from the other Southeast Asian countries to join the OECD as part of their own bureaucracy reform. And the second thing, I think the shares of the Indonesia local business to the OECD member countries can increase because Indonesian company, Indonesian government can meet the highest standard of the OECD member countries. And I think the third one is about the environmental. Perhaps after joining the OECD, Indonesia can increase the environmental protection standard, the deforestation is declining, and we can increase the number of partnership, for instance, in terms of the carbon market initiative. So many of the European company can invest in Indonesia renewable energy and also can help many of the circular economy growing in Indonesia. But I think Indonesia test to join the OECD. Let's see. This is one of the Southeast Asian country first one to join the OECD. I think in the long road we want to see many of the challenges, but I do believe that Indonesian government, local government, and business player have a capacity to meet the OECD standard in the near future.
Now, Bima, among all the regulations we have there, do you think the country's existing trade and investment regulation still needs a further change to meet the OECD's benchmark then?
I think we need some change to the international trade itself. Even though we are part of the WTO, we are part of the many of the bilateral and multilateral international trade pact. However, we need to adjust, for instance, to export some raw materials from Indonesia, the critical materials for the EV, for the battery. We need to consider the environmental safeguard. That's part of the regulations that somehow many of the Indonesia mining still have a lower concern about the European environmental standard or OECD standard. And I think the second thing is about the certifications, the qualifications of many of the Indonesia local product. Of course, we have national standard or SNI as a part of Indonesia certifications. But to enter the OECD member market, perhaps there still need many of the standard to protect the consumers in the EU, consumers in the Turkey, consumers in the Chile, for instance, in the OECD member country. So we need to set up a higher standard for quality of product, safetyness of the product. I think that's many things. Once again, that Brazil currently need to adjust 251 standard or regulation to join the OECD. And I think we need to apply some kind of a 250 standard to meet the OECD regulation. Same with the Brazil and the other countries that want to join OECD.
So we still have a bit of way to go to become an OECD member, but thank you, Bima Yudhistira, for joining us here at Economic Outlook. Bima Yudhistira, the Executive Director of Center of Economic and Law Studies, Orselius. Thank you so much.
Yeah, welcome.